Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to my Hardware Pioneers presentation, which is Europe and North American market access for wireless devices. I'm James Gardner. This is a picture of me looking much less nervous in Vietnam last year. I'm basically senior sales executive at UL. I've been in the TIC industry now for 5 years. I'm a major accounts manager focusing on growing business in the UK and Ireland. My main areas of expertise lie in the radio EMC world. I wouldn't go as far to call myself an expert, but these are conversations that I have with clients every day and have done for the last 5 years. So hopefully you'll all learn something today. And yeah, let's crack on. So we're going to cover mainly the Radio Equipment Directive and the requirements for CE marking for wireless devices. We'll touch upon the requirements for FCC and Canada towards the end as well. And then a few other wireless certification programs, which I think that you guys as manufacturers should be wary of. So who here is familiar with the Radio Equipment Directive? Put your hand up if you are. Has anyone gone to the effort of reading it all? Yeah, some people sort of. Okay, so that's good. That means hopefully, if I do a good enough job, you should all come away from this having learned something. The Radio Equipment Directive, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a directive designed by the European Union to cover the requirements for radio equipment. And it's a piece of legislation, the Radio Equipment Directive, so it's long-winded, it's very difficult to read, and frankly, very, very boring. So what I'm going to try and do is focus on the key areas that I believe you guys as manufacturers should be most aware of. So let's start with Article 3. Article 3 is one of the most important articles for you guys to be aware of because it outlines the essential requirements. Now, the essential requirements are just that, they're essential. You have to show in your technical construction file at the end of your compliance process that you have satisfied these requirements. So 3.1a is that you guys have to construct a product which you can say is safe, electrically safe, so that it doesn't cause harm to humans, domestic animals, or property. 3.1b is a requirement that most people will be familiar with in the hardware industry because it's that of EMC. You guys as manufacturers have to ensure that your product is EMC safe, and it calls up the EMC directive here. Article 3.2 is the provision for efficient use of the radio spectrum. So this bit focuses primarily on the radio's performance and the radio's use of the radio spectrum. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on Article 3.3 because it's additional requirements. Not all of them are always required, and we only have 25 minutes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about combined products. Most of this talk is going to be focused on manufacturers who are combining a non-radio product with a radio product and thus making that end product a Radio Equipment Directive product. So when does RED apply? So RED applies whenever you have a non-radio product and you're combining it with a piece of radio equipment which is incorporated into that non-radio product or permanently affixed. All right, so this graphic should give a decent demonstration of this relationship. So product A could be a non-radio product like a speaker or an autoclave, to be really random. And product B could be a Bluetooth radio module. So the combination of those two products together takes a non-radio product and essentially turns it into a radio product, which then you have to comply with the Radio Equipment Directive. I just wanted to take a quick moment to introduce you, if you haven't been introduced already, to EG 203367. And I know it's a standard, you don't really want to be introduced to it. But it's a guidance document produced to aid manufacturers through the process of combining radio equipment with non-radio equipment. So if you are in that position and you are trying to go through this process, I do recommend reading it. It's not that long, it's like 6 or 7 pages or something. So yeah, I would recommend that. Okay, so now we understand what the essential requirements are, and hopefully we understand what a combined product is. And we also understand, well, you've also been introduced to the guidance document required to guide you through that process. This next slide answers the question, well, okay, we know these things, but what do we need to do about it? What are the conformance assessment procedures? What do I need to do practically, physically? Do I need to test? Don't I need to test, etc.? So scenario one looks at that relationship between a radio product and a non-radio product which have been combined. Now, this could be a speaker which somebody has decided to put a Wi-Fi radio on. The speaker may already have some compliance evidence. The radio may already have some compliance evidence. And ETSI 203.367 provides reference to the conformity assessment procedure of using some of the existing evidence and then doing an additional assessment to cover any gaps that may exist. So that's one way of doing it for this equipment. The second scenario is a piece of radio equipment, effectively. So what's the conformity assessment procedure for, say, a Bluetooth module on its own? Well, in that instance, you would just apply the conformity assessment procedures outlined in the Radio Equipment Directive. So those are, you test it to harmonized standards for radio and EMC. So for a Bluetooth module, that would be ETSI EN 300.328. You may apply the EMC functional, radio functional standard for EMC, which is 301.489-17, and then that's it. The third scenario looks at the same equipment as the first scenario, but in this instance, we may not have any existing compliance documentation, or you, as a manufacturer, may have no confidence in it. So in that case, you can treat it very similar to as you would if it was a radio module. You would effectively apply the conformity assessment procedures outlined in red, test it to the radio standards that are applicable and the EMC standards. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what you need to do, or at least what process you need to follow in order to get to a point where you can start to think about claiming compliance. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on the clicker. Okay, so I wanted to get into a little bit more detail about Article 3.1b, which, as we now know, is the EMC part of the essential requirements. So as manufacturers, when you're combining equipment, you need to confirm two things from an EMC perspective. Now, I don't know if anybody was here listening to James Porton's speech earlier, but he went into great detail about what EMC is and how EMC works. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about what regulations you need to consider from an EMC perspective. So when you're combining radio equipment, you have to look at the EMC for the radio functionality, which is covered by the 301.489 series, and the EMC requirements for the product's functionality. For a speaker or for a screen like this, that might be EN 55052 and 55, or for lab equipment, it could be EN 61326, etc. Another thing that I wanted to reference a past speech on is actually, I don't know if anyone was here last night, but Michael Darby did a very good talk where he spoke about risk, and he mentioned a bit about worst case modes of operation. Now that's something that I also wanted to pick up on, because it's really important that you guys as manufacturers understand your product and you understand not only what modes of operation it has, but what's the worst case. So that's something that I wanted to introduce you to if you hadn't already been introduced. So to summarize EMC, it's about understanding operational modes, worst case operational modes, but also acknowledging that there are two parts to EMC compliance. The next bit's a bit boring, but it's important. It's a precursor to the following slides. So equivalent assessment conditions are effectively the assessment conditions at which a radio module or a piece of radio equipment has been tested by a module manufacturer or by an OEM, with the intention of them being able to reuse that documentation, or for their customers to be able to reuse that documentation. The reason why it's a precursor is because we're now going to talk about reusing existing assessments and evidence. Now, this as a salesperson, as somebody who speaks to clients every single day, this is something that people really care passionately about because it saves them money. it saves them time to market, and genuinely less headaches. So the question is, can you reuse existing evidence and for EMC? And you can. The answer is you can. If you're installing a radio module into a host product, and you're doing so as per those assessment conditions that I just mentioned, then, and according to the installation instructions provided by the original manufacturer, then you can reuse that EMC evidence. You can also do so if the products never operate at the same time. So, for example, an autoclave, if it's no longer autoclaving, then you can use the Bluetooth radio exclusively, and you wouldn't then need to do any reassessment. And obviously, the need for full reassessment is the complete reverse of that. So if you do change the equivalent assessment conditions, then you do need to do a full reassessment. And likewise, if the equivalent assessment conditions are different and they are operating at the same time, then you also need to reassess. Now we're going to ask the same question, but focusing on radio. So in Article 3.2, what does it say? What does ETSI 203.367 say about reusing existing assessments? Well, it's very similar to EMC. You can still do it. You know, there are ways of doing it. And it's very important that when purchasing radio equipment and installing it into your host, you have a decent enough relationship with the person you're buying it off so that you can understand these things. And they are, again, the equivalent assessment conditions. So the equivalent assessment conditions need to be the same. You need to install it as per their instructions, because that's what they're intending for you to use in. And you can't deviate from, you can't change any kind of physical parameters or any layout of the radio at all. If you do that, then you have to reassess. So to summarize, you can reuse existing radio evidence as long as the equivalent assessment conditions are the same and that you've installed according to the installation instructions. You may not be totally confident in that you have the equivalent assessment conditions and the installation instructions, and you may choose to do extra testing, limited testing, or full testing. That's a risk balance that manufacturers have to kind of weigh up. But strictly, you don't have to, if these are followed. So that brings us on to multi-radio equipment. So multi-radio equipment is, if you think back to the graphic where we had product A, product B equals product C, this is where you'd have product A being a non-radio product, and then you have a product B, a product C, a product D, and they're all different radios. So it could be a speaker with Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, GNSS receiver, all functioning at the same time. That would then be a multi-radio product. So what does that mean for you guys as manufacturers? Well, you can still use the same conformity assessment procedures that we've just outlined for single radio products. You can still use existing evidence if the equivalent assessment conditions are correct. But there are other things you have to think about for multi-radio equipment. So if you're doing this, you have to reassess spurious emissions, and you should also consider intermodulation. So I'm not a massive expert in exactly what intermodulation is, but it's when you have multiple different radios transmitting at a similar time, and they can create interferences with one another, which can cause non-compliances. I hope the UL engineers are proud of me for maybe getting that right. Okay, so again, just to clarify, multi-radio equipment, for you guys, you have to be able to understand what the different modes are, what is typical operation. You will have to define, what radios are transmitting together, which aren't. So that kind of brings us to an end of the radio equipment directive part. It brings us an end to CE marking. So hopefully everyone has a better understanding or an understanding of what the core things, the core processes that you have to follow to start getting yourself to a compliant point. And they are CE marking, which is self-declaration based on declaration of conformity, which you will have to sign when you're ready. The directive is the radio equipment directive. The requirements, the essential requirements, we know are safety, EMC, and radio. And how do we demonstrate that conformity? Well, it's with a technical construction file at the end of the process. And obviously your TCF, for those who don't know, will feature your test reports. It will feature risk assessments that you've put together and that's your kind of Bible of compliance for that product. That has to be what you use as evidence to back up your declaration of conformity. Okay. So now we move on to the FCC and the USA. We're going to mention Canada briefly, but because we've not got loads of time, we're going to kind of treat the US and Canada as one. They're not strictly the same, but in terms of process, they're very similar. So if anybody at the end isn't sure, has specific questions about Canada, then feel free to come and speak to me afterwards and we can delve into it a little bit deeper. So what is the FCC? So it stands for the Federal Communications Commission. It's independent US government agency overseen by Congress. They oversee all authorization of radio equipment in North America, in the USA. How do you become FCC compliant? A very big question, for which there are two relatively simple answers. So I'm actually going to start with Route 2, because Route 2 is the more simple process to understand. It's the route of certification. So if you have a radio transmitter and it's not already gone through any FCC certification, then you will have to go through a certification process, which means full testing with an accredited test house. It means going through an FCB and a TCB for Canada, and then at the end you'll get an FCC ID which you can use, display on your product, and is basically your license to sell that radio equipment in the USA. The second route it's not more complicated, but it applies in different circumstances. So even though you've certified a radio product, you may then still have to do what we call an SDOC, or Supplier's Declaration of Conformity. If your product is not a transmitter or an intentional radiator, and it's, say, just a receiver-only product, then this is the route that you would go down. It's not a similar Declaration of Conformity as to Europe, so it's important not to get confused, because in Europe there is room for you to maneuver. There is room for you to kind of be creative with how you do things. There still isn't in SDOC. You still have to do EMC testing to the applicable standard. It's just at the end of that, you will sign a declaration of conformity, which says you've done it. So it mandates people to do that. So SDOC is still relatively simple, but applies to receiver-only products and products which still are transmitters. You still have to do this for your EMC. So this goes into a bit more detail about SDOC. So I've pretty much just gone through this. You don't have to go through any official registration. It makes a responsible party, and we'll get to what responsible party means in a minute. It puts a legally binding mandate on that responsible party to do the EMC testing and to do the testing necessary. Okay, so what's a responsible party? So similar to the European Union CE marking, where you have to have a representative in Europe to kind of be your legal representation, there's a similar thing for North America. So a responsible party is typically a manufacturer, because most big manufacturers have some representation in the US, but it could be an assembler, it could be an importer, or it could be another third party who you've come to a legally binding agreement with for them to take on the liability of your product. This party is responsible for full compliance. So if anything went wrong, those are the people who are responsible. And yeah, you have to have one, and they have to have a presence in the United States. Sorry, did you get your photo? Oh, cool. Okay, so similar to in Europe, where we were touching on integrating radio equipment and non-radio equipment, if you're integrating an FCC approved module into your product, so you don't have to go down the full certification process, testing certification process, you don't have to do the full testing. But it's not totally that simple. So if you're integrating a module, you have to make sure that you've integrated it into the product as per the grant conditions. Now, the grant conditions are put there by the FCC when they've certified that original piece of radio equipment. you have to then also install it as per the installation instructions, similar to what you have to do for Europe. But you also should, emphasis on the word should perform radiated spurious emissions testing on that radio to make sure that the radio performance hasn't changed dramatically when it's been placed into the host product. Now, the reason why it should is because that's how it's written in their guidance documents. But there's really no way of guaranteeing that it isn't the same without doing some spurious emissions testing. So it is recommended that people do it. Of course, as well, you will have to label correctly. Cannot forget labeling. You have to make sure that the FCC ID for the original equipment is listed on the product. And the same applies for Canada as well. The IC ID will also have to be on the product somewhere. Okay, so again, a quick summary on FCC and Canada. Apologies that we've kind of rushed through it, but again, if anyone has specific questions about this process, feel free to reach out afterwards. Hopefully you have a better basic understanding of the process. The market access is FCC ID. For transmitters, the path is certification. For non-transmitters, the path is SDoc. And then, of course, labeling requirements as well. So a few things that I wanted to just quickly make you aware of, because manufacturers can sometimes forget that they need to do this as well. If you're incorporating any of these technologies into your products and you're going to use their logos, etc., you have to be aware that there's sometimes validation schemes or special interest group schemes and testing that you have to do. And sometimes there's registration costs as well. So we're not going to go into great detail here, but it's something that I wanted you to be aware of, because you can't just chuck a Bluetooth radio into your product and forget about it. You know, there's registration that has to happen. So that's the end of the technical part of the presentation. I'm not going to do a sales pitch because that's not why I'm here. But UL can help cover all of these requirements. Feel free to reach out to myself or anyone at the UL booth for more information. Here's just a brief summary of the different industries that UL serves. Our test labs across Europe. Of course, UL is an American business, so we have tons of sites in the US, a lot of presence in Asia, and some presence in South America as well. So we're not restricted to the UK or Europe. Okay, so yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you want, and follow LinkedIn, follow UL Solutions on LinkedIn. Thank you. Thank you. Cheers.